So welcome to you all to Landscape Research Group's Research Fund Showcase, where we get to show off some of our funded projects. My name is Emily Shakespeare. I'm the Communications Manager at the LRG. I've seen some familiar names in the registration, so hello to you, and also some new ones as well, so you're very welcome, and do please stay in contact. I'm just going to do some housekeeping. The event's being recorded, so I'll be able to put it up on the website afterwards so you can watch it again. And if you, as you think of questions as you go along, if you could put them into the Q&A box at the bottom there, and then we'll be able to have a look at them and answer them, hopefully answer them at the end. And I'm going to do a quick sales pitch. That's my job. So please do consider becoming a member of LRG, and then you're able to support our work, which enables us to support researchers like the ones we're going to hear from today. And you also get to access a network of like-minded landscape researchers and practitioners. Okay, so over to business. We're going to be chaired today by Karen Jones, one of our trustees, and Karen is Professor of Environmental History at the University of Kent in the UK. She's been a trustee with us since 2020, and up till now she's been working a bit behind the scenes, so she'll be evaluating the research fund applications as they came in. So now she's stepping up to the front and stepping into Hannes Palang's large shoes to become the official research coordinator. So I'm going to pass you over to her capable hands. Thank you, Karen.
Thanks, Emily. Well, it's great to be here, and I'm really excited to hear from our presenters, because I can remember their applications in 2020 at that stage. So I'm really curious to see how these projects have played out in the real world. The theme for the 2021 round, of which all of our presenters here were contributing to, was Landscape Virtue and the Common Good, which spoke to a theme at the heart of LRG's ethos in its interdisciplinary focus on questions of injustice and justice in the realm of landscape. And I think all of our presentations today speak to the sort of textured histories of governance and justice and injustice and complicated relations between humans and the environment. So each of our presenters will talk for about 15 minutes and outline their projects and ideas in sequence. I'm going to introduce them all and set them live to run free. And then we'll have Q&A at the end, which will hopefully make some nice connections between the papers and give an opportunity for our participants and our attendees to talk together. Before I forget, which I'm likely to do by the time we get to the end of the slot, for those of you who are attending this with an eye to the current round, the 2023 round on landscapes and care, it's really good to see, I think, what successful applications look like. So as well as content, this is a masterclass in how to put together a successful project proposal. Right, so that's definitely enough from me. So I'm really delighted to introduce Mary, kicking things off for us this afternoon. Mary Biggs from the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, who is going to be speaking about public history and outdoor recreation and sort of complicated contours of commemoration, heritage, public history, and racial justice and injustice. So over to you, Mary.
Thank you, Karen. Wonderful. And thank you all. I'm so thrilled to be here with all of you today. I am going to do that Zoom thing where I share my screen and hope for the best. Can everyone see screen? I'm gonna assume yes. That is wonderful. Start my timer as well. All right. Well, without further ado, just honored to kick things off. As Karen said, I'm Mary. I use she and her pronouns. I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of Geography at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, which was built through the labor of enslaved people on Eno, Shakori, Saponi, and Occaneechi land. And today I'll be sharing just a small section of my dissertation research. I've been very embedded in this work, so I could go on for much longer than 15 minutes, but I've cut myself down to just a little section of this research, which has been generously funded through the LRG Research Grant. This presentation, I'm going to go into further detail on a methodology that I developed for visitor interviews during my field work at 3 plantation museums in North Carolina this past summer. But do want to give first a little bit of background on my project and the sites that I study. So I study landscape level intersections between public history and outdoor recreation and tourism. My dissertation research is based at 3 plantation museums in North Carolina, owned and operated by the state. And we have here a little map to show just kind of where they are in their closest big cities. All 3 were plantations in the 18th and early 19th centuries. And all 3 today are plantation museums that are actually working very hard to excavate histories and narratives that have previously been buried at these sites and at plantation museums across the US, specifically the stories of enslaved communities, the lives and struggles and resilience of Black people under chattel slavery, and the connections between the transatlantic slave trade and our world today. So materials at all 3 sites, new and developing materials, all highlight the identities and the lives of these enslaved people in direct response to plantation museums historically, and many still today, which hide or otherwise obscure these stories. So at Vance, I'm going to show some pictures here. This is Vance Birthplace. They have recently erected a sign which is now visible from the road and has the names of all the people known to have been enslaved on that land by the Vance family. They've incorporated these people's stories into interpretation. They are continuing to build relationships with the modern day descendant community. At Staggville in central North Carolina, there are 4 original dwellings built by and for enslaved people, which are still standing today and which form the heart of much of the interpretation that goes on there. And at Somerset Place, all the way in the east, there have been decades of work researching the genealogy of enslaved families and reconstructing slave cabins. So I say all this to kind of set the scene that these sites are working hard with the support of program staff to tell full and complex stories of antebellum Southern life across the state. These sites also sit directly alongside or even within spaces of outdoor recreation. And they themselves also serve as spaces of outdoor recreation for dog walkers, picnickers, school groups, and the like. Plantation Museum scholarship tells us that this can be problematic. That is, that tensions inevitably arise between the role of plantation museums as spaces where members of the public can go to learn about and reckon with slavery, and spaces where people go on holiday for a fun afternoon hike or for a walk with their dogs. The Plantation Museum literature that doesn't bring up the tensions often doesn't necessarily address this aspect of plantation museums at all. It will talk about what and how visitors are taking in, or what and how tour guides are presenting materials, without considering the fact that many of the visitors are there on vacation, or what else they're doing with their day, the landscapes at a very literal level around these spaces of education. And at all 3 sites, they are intimately connected. Vance, the one in the Western Mountains, is 5 miles off the Blue Ridge Parkway, which is a super popular and famous driving route through the Tennessee and North Carolina mountains. Staggville, pictured here on the left, is on the edge of a land conservancy with walking trails, several of which leave directly from the site's land. And Somerset, pictured on the right, is actually inside a state park with a walking trail called the Carriage Trail. I don't know if you can read it here, which does actually follow the carriage trail of the white owning family, cutting right through the historic space. So at all 3, the lines between histories of enslavement and outdoor recreation can be very blurry. And this is not unique to these sites. Rather, it's an often unquestioned feature of plantation museums and historic sites across the US. So in my research, I became curious what visitors are thinking about this, and more to the point, what are they feeling about all this? Because a lot of wonderful recent work in heritage studies is attending to what scholars term the more than representational. So this can include the embodied, the felt sense of being in a space of public memory, commemorative atmospheres. There's a lot of really wonderful literature on that, And feminist geography, which is a foundational part of my praxis, urges us to consider the embodied, the banal, and the everyday in our investigation. So, and I further follow scholars of emotional geographies who name emotions not as purely individual or interior phenomena, but rather as circulating in the world, giving us pertinent information about social situations and interventions. So, right, this question of how are these spaces coinciding? How are they impacting each other? I wanted to study at the scale of the body. So I created a method drawing on pencil and paper interviews done at other historic sites that I hoped would allow visitors to make this kind of record for themselves and then share it back to me. I worked with a good friend of mine who is an artist and a museum studies scholar herself to make 3 hand-drawn maps, one for each site. I wanted visitors to feel like they'd been handed a really engaging activity and to not be afraid to mark these things up. I gave these maps along with sheets of stickers pictured here and black pens to willing participants at each of these historic sites. I asked that they use the stickers and pens in whatever combination they wanted to mark what they were doing and how they were feeling about it at different parts of the site. And before they left, I asked that they return the materials to me. This was my setup at Somerset Place, and answer just a few quick questions about the map. So like, why did you put this sticker there, for example, or tell me more about what you were feeling here. And the resulting maps tell a really beautiful visual story of emotion and its complexities at these sites, as well as the transformations and overlaps that people were experiencing. The method itself was both simple enough that visitors of all ages and all backgrounds could do it easily during their time at the site. I didn't want to, saddle people with a really time-intensive project, but it was also nimble enough so people got really creative, which made it a really participatory and collaborative method. And I brought up a couple examples here. You can see on the left the overlapping emotions, the happy faces and the sad faces. You can see on the right how people would sometimes use their pens to mark these transitions, right? They enter a space feeling one way, they come out of it feeling a different way. The one on the left here is one of my favorites. The folks who did it called it their Christmas response, right? Speaking to the red and the green combination and the really complex emotions that they were feeling. They specifically said that they were very sad hearing about the histories of enslavement at Somerset Place, but happy that these histories had been preserved and were being shared with them in that moment. Some people wrote quite a bit on their maps. Here's one example on the right. Again, this person had a similar experience. They liked hearing the history, but it's not a happy story. So again, these different emotions. And some folks got super creative with it. You can see here the participant drew angry eyebrows. The red frowning face did not do enough justice to the intense emotions that she was experiencing. So she was able to use the pen in that really creative way. So once I had those maps done, I did sort of put them together in a couple different ways. This is one example at Vance Birthplace, and it allowed me to create, again, this is one example, but a couple different kinds of graphics that demonstrated the ways in which emotions are circulating at these sites, which tell really interesting stories of their own about visitor experiences. And so again, here is a similar graphic from Somerset Place. And when paired with the short structured interviews I also conducted with these folks, you start to see a lot of really interesting nuances that are coming out of and also feeding back into these landscape level relationships between learning history and being in beautiful space, recreating in beautiful space. So to finish this novel participatory mapping methodology, it told me a lot more about how people were engaging with these landscapes, both the educational spaces like guided tours and the spaces in between and around those educational spaces, the spaces of outdoor recreation, than I could have hoped. It was a really fun and collaborative way to get a glimpse into how visitors were experiencing these sites beyond just what they were kind of being told or what they were retaining. And I've used these maps for other sections of my dissertation as well, looking at how people feel about the landscape specifically, right, about the beauty or the visuals of these landscapes, or what emotions arise when talking about white supremacy in our world today. And I am happy to share a bit more. I think we'll get into the Q&A afterwards, but again, just wanted to say thank you all so much for your attention. Thanks to the LRG for the funding and for this great opportunity to connect with all you amazing folks. I will cede a couple minutes of my time back to the group and stop sharing. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Mary. That was amazing. I really like this sort of emotional mapping of place and history. I think those themes are going to resonate as we move along. Our second panel is from Laura Rowe and Richard Irvine, who are both from the University of St Andrews in the UK. And they're going to be talking to us on their project called Carbon Afterlives, Coal Addiction and the End of Mining Life in Fife, which I think again thinks about the trauma of space and social relations, and how you deal with interpreting a carboniferous space in the context of a community in location as well. So over to you, Laura and Richard.
Thanks, that's great. I'll just share my screen. Just get this into, oh, sorry. There we go, hope that's working. Okay, so I'll let Richard start.
Thanks. So, I mean, the impulse to do this project came out of conversations that myself and Laura had been having. We were both working in Scottish landscapes, but in different ways, but ways that we thought could be interestingly related. So I work on the history of the landscape, human relationship with environmental change, and thinking about human place in relation to these deep time formations. And in Fife, of course, this relationship with the coal seams have driven its economic history. And Laura was working on addiction and on drug use in Scotland. And we were sort of interested in how these quite different timescales, but also quite different issues might be seen to relate within this same landscape. And really what it comes at is this idea that there's a moral dissonance when we think about these former mining areas. When we think about this from the perspective of planetary climate change, when we think about this in the context of leaving carbon in the ground, the closure of mines seems like an unproblematic moral good. But in the context of communities such as Fife, the end of mining is seen as a cause of continued social harm, the resulting lack of skilled employment, and also the loss of the cohesive identity that mining gives communities, being seen as having these corrosive social effects. And so what we wanted to explore within the landscape was this moral dissonance, thinking about the future of the landscape, and thinking about the future of a post-carbon Scotland, post-carbon fueled Scotland, but in the context of these senses of residual moral harm, and in particular the context of drug addiction, which Laura will speak to.
Thank you. Yeah, just to give some brief kind of context, I worked in Fife, I worked a bit in Edinburgh. It was specifically on people's experiences of addiction and drug use. Scotland is a very specific context. I think it's got a real, there's a crisis at the moment. We've got the highest drug-related deaths in Europe. The rates of death in Europe, there were 1,330 deaths last year, which was the second highest number ever recorded. It dropped by 9, I think. And that's because there's very specific kind of patterns of use where people use very intensive kind of cocktails of drugs, mostly heroin, cocaine, Valium, in these kind of patterns with alcohol and things like this. And there's a lot of underlying kind of reasons for that, which is that we've got really high pockets of deprivation. There's delayed effects of kind of really serious historical deprivation, policy, things like this, but also deindustrialization. So like Richard was saying, these continued reverberating effects of the loss of coal, this loss of livelihood, that just continue to kind of shape people's present experiences. So yeah, we were interested in exploring what the continuities were between these kind of coal communities that have been so long-standing and long-lasting, and the collapse of that, and how that's sort of gone on to everyday life. So this was kind of a culmination of different research activities, starting with my ethnographic research, which was 12 months of just sort of working in recovery spaces, but also with people who use drugs in their sort of daily lives. And that kind of led us onto landscape, to energy transition, and experiences of drug use. And then on to finally this exhibition, which is kind of what we're going to talk about today, and the field workshops that we did in the lead up to this, and how they fed into this exhibition, which I'll talk about in a minute. But I'll let Richard pick up again with the tale of the workshops that we did about landscape and coal and Fife.
So what we wanted to do as part of this LRG project was to try and expand out these conversations that Laura and I had already been having, bringing in restoration, a recovery group, and Laura will talk about their role in co-curating the exhibition with her, but also bringing together people with different kinds of expertise and understanding of the landscape, and in particular to do this in a couple of different field workshops. We wanted to go out, walk within these spaces, and make the landscape an active participant in these conversations. And so we were bringing together in these spaces different kinds of disciplinary expertise. So Karina Fernley, who's a geologist at UCL, Miles Oglethorpe from Historic Environment Scotland, Nora Westfield, who's a mental health nurse, now with the Scottish Drug Forum, Ewan Gibbs, a historian, and trying to bring our different perspectives and understandings of this landscape into conversation. And so starting at Longannet, which was the power station on the Fife Coast, closed in 2016. We were sort of lucky enough, I suppose you could say, to see the chimney while it was still there. It was demolished in 2021 with in December 2021 with a light show and Make Coal History projected on the side of it. But while we were sort of walking in that landscape, we were thinking about the geology that's underfoot. What was it that drove the shift towards the Upper Hurst coal seam, the change in mining practices, the relationship between the deep mine, the drift mine at Longannet and the power station, and thinking about that both in terms of that shift in the seams that are used in geology, but also the associated labor shifts. What happened in this change of mining? And we were thinking about this in the context of futures, thinking about that make coal history that we didn't yet know was going to be projected onto the chimney, but that was obviously, with the closure of that mine, with the closure of that power station, thinking about that post-carbon future, what's going to be done with those sites, the possibility of that becoming a carbon storage site, but also thinking about the impact that this has had on the landscape there. So we went from there to the Valleyfield Lagoons. And this is an island that became a peninsula as a result of this ash that was placed there after the coal was burned at the power station. And so this is sort of a physical transformation of the landscape. You can see some of the ash here, which built up the reclaimed land, and you can see us there sitting in the presence of the Preston Island mine, which is an early coal mine that was where coal was mined for salt panning. And while we're sitting there, we're thinking about that context of this deep past of the coal in the landscape, the transformations, the physical transformations of the landscape, but also these emotional transformations, as we just heard in the last presentation, how this is also an emotional geography. And so hearing from Norma Westfield about the emotional impacts of deindustrialization and how that and how those experiences continue to cut into lives through addiction. Can we go on to the next slide, Laura? And then on the next day, we went to Lacor Meadows. This is a leisure site, but it's a leisure site built on the former Mary Colliery when that land was reclaimed and landscaped after the closure of the mine there in 1966. And so that enabled us to think about these kinds of different social uses of the space, what happens when these sites of quite deep meaning become leisure spaces, again, as we were just hearing about, but also thinking about the difference between that wave of mine closures in the 1960s and the social impacts then, as people found other industrial work, as people found work in other mines, such as Longinus, and the subsequent closure of mines in the 1980s and 1990s. What can we learn from those differences as we're thinking about future energy transitions? And then we took that energy transition theme to Westfield. This is what was once known as the largest hole in Europe. It's an open cast mining landscape. And here you can see the impact of that open cast mining in the traces of pollution from the runoff from the open cast mine. You can also see how this landscape is being transformed into a new energy park with the presence of wind turbines there. But of course, that's a changing economic relationship. That's a very different in terms of the number of people employed, in terms of the relationship between the labor and the community. There's a shift in what that means. So how then, as we're walking in this landscape, we're having these conversations, how do we navigate these future energy transitions? So the process of these workshops then fed into, alongside the work that Laura was doing with Restoration, Drugs Recovery Charity, the process of these workshops then fed into the exhibition that we put together.
Thank you. Yes, so the exhibition, yeah, like Richard was saying, a lot of the theoretical narrative came from those workshops and with collaborations with Restoration and with people who use drugs. It was on in October, it was in St Andrews. Here's just a couple of photographs of the kind of cases and the purpose of it. So it kind of started out with this as a history of mining. We wanted to look at that in and of itself, the kind of community life that was structured around coal mining throughout the 20th century. So starting kind of well back towards the beginning and tracing it almost in a linear fashion through that. We'll start even before that with the deep time things that Richard was talking about, the kind of very beginning, a history of coal. And then interrupting that, I think, with experiences of drug use that through time kind of out of its linear sort of step into more kind of blurred, non-linear experiences. But the way the room was organized was very much, we began with coal communities, things like this. I'll just show you. Yeah, the kind of galas, things like that used to happen, the kind of huge attendance at funerals when someone would die, because obviously it was a hugely dangerous job as well. There were all these facets of coal life. And then this kind of build up and build up and build up towards the 1980s where things just were completely dismantled, completely collapsed. And again, had this huge outpouring of community and community solidarity that was just kind of disrupted and led to, I think, this sense for my participants who were using heroin and things like that of isolation, of unemployment, and all of these big health inequalities. All of this was tying into their kind of everyday life. But there was still community, and I think that's what the exhibition was trying to show, was this kind of grassroots level solidarity and belonging is still there. It's just being fragmented through drug use, even as it's being formed again through drug use. And then in recovery as well, on the recovery side of it, these local community groups that are trying to form this sense of community belonging and heritage and things like that. And it's deeply invested in the landscape. So restoration itself continually do sort of landscape walks. They go to these old coal sites and have picnics and barbecues and things, all of this situated in the kind of landscape. Even though I have to say, when I was doing my research, a lot of the landscape and coal sort of history was very much on the periphery. It didn't really take a center stage. It was just kind of in the background, and all of these kind of, all the photos that we've had of the colliery structures and everything like that were just sort of half forgotten, even though it was a continual presence in people's lives. When it did come up, it was, this is again part of the exhibition, a quote that we used, but it kind of describes it well, of reflecting on mining, of someone saying it was a hard life down the pit, it was hard on the body, long hours in the darkness, dangerous too, in the lungs, the dust. That was just life. It was everything to them. It was everything to folk close knit, kind of that community side, that working class community thing. That's all gone now, or not gone exactly, but they lost something like that. What do we have now? Dole, kit, drugs. It's not all so bleak. I've been an addict all my life, started taking when I was 14. My granddad was down the pit at that age. And I'm not saying it was a better life, it was hard going, but it was a generational thing. It seems a shame to me anyway. It wasn't all that long ago when you think about it, but it's not all gloom. It has to come from the ground up. All good things come from the ground up. And I wouldn't say that was a common sentiment, because it was hard to talk to people about this sort of thing and about coal, but it was certainly a thread that ran through things, that kind of intergenerational impact that this loss kind of had. So yeah, again, I'll just kind of, oh, we're doing a fade now. So again, part of this was to show the continuities and discontinuities. So we had this kind of framing of these old photographs. I just decided to do a slideshow all of a sudden. Yeah, these old sort of photographs in direct contrast with today, where I was going about my field work and doing things like that. So there's the Mary Colliery, the Francis Colliery, on the right there, on the left there, sorry, in Dysart. Yeah, again, this is just an example of how we kind of showed that community life through photographs, these old archival photos from the Mining Museum. So we have a gala at the top left there. That was one of the funerals from a mining disaster at the bottom, and then sort of progressing through to the 80s, where we had this history of protest and solidarity through that. And then we invited people, we invited people to contribute items, people who use drugs, to give an item that meant something to them and explain their kind of narrative and story around it and how it impacted on their lives. So I won't go into detail, but we had these kind of artworks, as you'll see again. So fishing community, a local fishing community in Pittenweem, at the bottom left. Someone also gave these, her own house was filled with these kind of figurines of children everywhere, and she sort of had relationships with them, and she wanted to show that as well. And then on the right, another sort of drawing that someone did that kind of, yeah, encapsulates a sense of time, I think, because it's full of clocks. But anyway, yeah, and I was going to play a little bit of the soundscape that we had playing in the actual exhibition, but I think I've taken up all of our time. I don't know if, Karen, do you mind if I'll just play a very quick clip. So this was in the exhibition.
Yeah, we're good to hear.
I think I started taking when I was on my 20th.
Yeah, I'll stop us there, but it sort of the idea is that it builds and builds, and it's a sound artist created it from recordings from the landscape, including kind of, and mining archival sounds as well, to kind of blend contemporary landscape and the mining sounds, with also excerpts from an interview with someone who uses drugs, describing their kind of experiences, but in a very kind of abstract way. Yeah, I don't know if that makes sense, but there we go. That was the idea behind that. So thank you. Yes.
Great, thanks Laura, thanks Richard. That was, again, really fascinating to see that sort of past, present and future in constant dialogue and renegotiation. You know, the idea of a picnic near the pit and all of the layers within that. Great. Okay, so our last panelist this afternoon is Jo Phillips from the University of Sheffield, who is going to take us to an equally contested landscape in many ways, but one which is greener, I suppose. Her project is on rewilding the public imagination and thinking through how you communicate the complexities of this conservation model, and particularly the ways in which photographs can be used as a way of sort of unpacking people's hierarchy of landscape preferences. So over to you, Jo.
Thank you, Karen. Okay, so yes, my project was called Rewilding the Public Imagination, an analysis of key themes in the visual communication of rewilding to a wider audience. And the context for this is very much, is really important to just illustrate my motivation for wanting to do the research. And that motivation is basically the threat of mass extinctions due to climate crisis, hunting and habitat loss. And this is therefore, I think, an injustice to nature and to the landscape itself. So the aims of rewilding projects are increased biodiversity and wildlife recovery. That's the key aims of what these what rewilders want to achieve. And that's in the face of data like the report that came out just last week, the Plant Atlas 2020 from the Botanical Society of Britain and Ireland, which counted more non-native species than native species in the wild in the UK. So the issue of space for native species is an issue, regardless of what you think of non-natives. Those natives are struggling to thrive. And 1 in every 5 UK plant species is classified as threatened with extinction, 2% already extinct. So I think this is important, and I wanted to learn more about it, and particularly about the sense of injustice that surrounds rewilding projects. We're just going to look quite quickly at just 3 of the themes I explored through my research, because it did cover quite a lot of ground. So this next photograph is a picture that I think will be really familiar to lots of people. It's taken of an area of sheep farmed land, upland area, and I travel to work from Manchester to Sheffield and back again through landscapes that are just like this. So I got this particular photograph from a website where it was captioned like this. So it says, Britain's hills and upland areas are some of the most beautiful in the world, with elevated areas of dramatic features such as hills, moors, valleys and mountains. For hundreds of years, hill sheep and cattle have grazed and shaped this landscape. Keeping livestock on the hills is the key to maintaining the character of these areas. And of course, this is such an interesting attitude, because it's one that denies the possibility of change in rural areas and wants to maintain the scene as it is in this photograph by continuing to graze the land. And this is what George Monbiot would call sheep-wrecked land, which was a term he coined in his influential book Feral about rewilding, and which has caused lots of controversy, but it has to be addressed, really, the conflict between what rural communities have always done and how people want to see our rural landscapes, and the aims of rewilding projects, which are very difficult to reconcile. So I wanted to understand that better, that relationship. Also in the caption to this photograph, it said, maintaining and developing biodiversity, protecting population centres from flood risk. And I don't think that is what this landscape does. I think that's not factual. And in fact, perhaps we should at least consider changing things like this, landscapes like this, which are what many of our national parks look like. So what is rewilding? We're going to briefly look at some of the controversies around that. Rewilding is sometimes framed as being anti-human. And this is not justified, I think, but there are accusations that there is a desire to return landscapes to some impossible ideal from before human occupation. But that isn't possible, and we know that, and it's not possible because perhaps there is no ideal. It's who would judge what that ideal was, but also because of climate change. So that's an unfair accusation to rewilding projects, I think. There's also a fear of reintroduction of top predators like wolves and wildcat species, and also raptors. The fear is that they will take livestock, but also that they might be a threat to humans as well. There's a fear as well of decrease in the value of agricultural land. Obviously, if people have put a lot of work in over generations to keeping land free of wild species and reserved entirely just for crops, then that land becomes recolonized by vegetation. There's a worry that this prime agricultural land will become scrubland, which will be worth nothing. And attached to that is this fear that established human relationships with cultivated land will become lost. So whether it's practical centuries-old management skills of agriculture and forestry, or whether it's more psychological and social connections of those farming communities, there's a worry that all that culture will be lost, and an understandable worry, I think. And all these factors, understanding these is key to understanding human relationships with nature, and I would say it's important for landscape architects to think about these as well. Just a quick thing about how rewilding works in order to help us define it. And trophic cascades is a really key term that's very useful to understand in terms of how rewilding is approached. The reintroduction of wolves to Yellowstone National Park in North America is a really well-known example of this. So I think many of you will have probably seen the video How Wolves Change Rivers, which you can watch online. And it's a really fascinating insight into what a trophic cascade is. And that is just simply when you make a change to a key part of the food web or the ecosystem, in this case, by introducing wolves, then that one intervention has cascading effects all through the food web. So just to very briefly summarize how that worked in Yellowstone. So wolves were reintroduced in 1995, so really fairly recently. And this had all sorts of cascading effects. So there was quite a big population of deer in the national park, and wolves killed a number of the deer. But also they changed the behavior of the surviving deer, so they avoided parts of the park, and those parts of the park started to regenerate. So what had been bare valley sides became colonized with trees because the deer weren't grazing off the new seedlings. Small trees that had been struggling to grow but were being grazed by the deer suddenly rapidly grew. So you had tree colonization all over these bare valley sides, which brought in birds, and then so many more species as well. Very rich biodiversity, beavers, otters, reptiles, and so on. Even bears started to increase in numbers. And then the most unexpected outcome of this of all was that the rivers also changed their course. As the trees started to retain the banks, the tree roots retained the soil, rivers began to braid differently, find different channels, natural pools were created, and so the whole landscape really had been re-engineered and repopulated through the action of the wolves. It's quite important to understand that because here in the UK, animals are now being used to help to manage landscapes, if you can use that word, for a rewilding project. But these are animals that are key in different locations around the UK. So at the top left there, you've got conic ponies. Those are at Wicken Fen in Cambridgeshire, and the aim there is to use the grazing of the ponies, which is very different to how sheep graze, to keep the landscape open, and that's what they're looking for there. And then the top right here, there's a picture from Wild Ennerdale where the Galloway cattle have been grazing in some parts of Ennerdale for more than 10 years now. And in those areas where the cattle have grazed, there's been a 65% increase in bird species. So that's huge. That's an enormous success. And that's because the cattle, again, graze differently to the sheep, but also they kick up the seed bank, as do all these animals. They raise the seeds in the soil, as you can see the pigs are doing there as well, by rooting up the turf and bringing seeds to the surface so that species can start to naturally regenerate. The pigs are at Knepp Estate in the south of England, which is a very much more commercial rewilding project, but still very successful. And you will have probably heard of beavers. There's a beaver dam on the left, bottom left there. You'll have heard of beaver reintroductions around the UK, and beavers are engineering our riverscapes, and there's a lot of potential there for reduction in flooding as a result of using those beavers. So those are the sort of animal species that tend to be used here in the UK, because we're not ready for wolves or lynx yet. So rewilding then is this unpredictable flourishing of natural processes and the ability of nature to thereby gradually recover itself on a landscape scale. And it's not the same, crucially, as conservation or restoration of specific habitats or species, because it's not about going back to the past. It's not about keeping things as they are. It's about releasing control. And so the first theme of my research that I identified was the importance of communicating open-ended processes and to the public, which is quite difficult, quite challenging, because there's some science there, and there's also a sense of needing to let go of control of these processes so that they're genuinely open-ended. There's already a lot of good practice in communicating this to the public. This is from the Rewilding Britain website. This is a before illustration of what a typical landscape looks like, with various management issues going on here that mean it's quite a denuded environment. And then this is their visualization of a landscape, the same landscape where rewilding processes have been going on for some years. So there's lots of good practice, and I wanted to understand it better. Part of the challenge in communicating rewilding to the public is this problem of shifting baseline syndrome, which was first used to describe perceptions of depleted fish stocks, but now it's come to refer to our different perceptions of landscape according to what they have been in our lifetime. So we tend to assume that landscape should be as it was as far back as we remember. And if you've lived in a landscape all your life and you're say you're a retired person, you might look back 70 years and think, well, that's how it used to be, that's how it should be now, and that it's a natural state. But in fact, we remember things that are already significantly depleted ecosystems. And so an example for me would be that in my childhood, I remember taking drives out into the countryside in my parents' car, and there would be flies, dead flies and mosquitoes and moths and all those sort of things on the windscreen of the car all through spring, summer and autumn. They'd be covered in splatted flies. And now that just doesn't happen. That's not a thing anymore because we're so depleted in insect life. The second theme of my research, which I haven't got very much time to go into, but is about how we view nature through the ideas of the beautiful, the sublime and the picturesque, different modes of viewing landscapes, which help us to understand what I was getting towards, which was viewing landscapes, viewing the wild landscapes through screens, or rewilding landscapes through screens. There's a sense that the screens have really changed our relationship with viewing wild or wilder landscapes because of that distance that we have from it. We can look at photographs now of landscape all the time on our social media channels, and we're not worried by looking at photos of wolves, because we know we're not going to be in contact with the wolves. So we're prepared to consider perhaps much greater degrees of wildness. And there's questions here that fascinate me about how much control we want, especially if we're landscape designers, how much control we want over the landscape, and whether we see a role for ourselves in the wild, whether members of the public see roles for themselves in wild places. So that relinquishing of control is a real challenge. Nan Fairbrother in 1970 argued that the countryside can fairly be considered as one of our national artistic achievements. And I think there's still an idea that the countryside should be that. But the rewilding is really challenging that idea, because it doesn't have a predetermined endpoint or target, and it's not about an aesthetic. It's ongoing, it's dynamic, it's uncertain, and it's beyond human control, because that's the very nature of wildness itself. Before and after photographs like this give us some sense of what might happen after 20 years. This is the Knepp estate before and after 20 years of very low intervention, as on the journey towards zero intervention, and that loosening of control in that area is very controversial with the residents. So I'll be brief because I'm aware of running out of time, but my research used practitioner interviews from these organisations. They were really helpful in identifying themes, because these were all people who are directly involved in communicating rewilding to the public. And I did a photograph survey as well through social media channels, where I showed different photographs of different degrees of rewilded space to participants, and they rated them on a Likert scale. And I was interested in affordances. So Gibson formulated his theory of affordances at first in 1979, and I was interested in whether people perceived if they could do something in the space, if it offered them an opportunity to be in the space and to be part of nature and to interact, how would they feel about that space as a result, or that landscape? And also the idea of legibility. Would people respond more positively to places that were legible and had visible affordances? So this can be my last slide. On the left, you'll see the most preferred photographs out of the 24 in the survey. So the top one there of the wildflowers is the most preferred of all the photographs, and then the second and the third most preferred. There's very little or to no evidence at all of human intervention or human presence in those landscapes. There's a very small path on the side of the river in that second photo down, and really you can't identify a lot of other clear human intervention in the landscape. So people actually really preferred to see landscapes that were on the wilder end of the spectrum. And then on the right hand of the screen, there are the least preferred landscapes, with the very least preferred being the car park at Ennerdale at the bottom there, even though it's a very attractive car park as they go. But people didn't enjoy so much seeing the car park, the signage, or evidence of camping in the wildflower field. They felt that that was not something that they wanted to see. So I think those were interesting results. I think it's very different from Kaplan and Kaplan's work, which informed my work and how I went about things. They thought that people needed to feel very safe in landscapes. I don't think that's true when we're viewing landscapes through social media. And because we have so many opportunities to look at these things through all these channels. So yeah, thank you very much. That time went very quickly. I'm sorry I overran slightly.
That's fine, Jo. Thank you very much. It took me back to Yellowstone Wolves, which is what I wrote my PhD on. So that was a nice little nostalgia trip for me. Yeah, some really interesting reflections on injustice to landscape, as well as taking place in landscape, and those different sort of filters of perception around safety and appreciation. So thanks to all of our presenters today for 3 really connected and interesting takes on landscape justice and injustice. We've got a few, literally 3 or 4 minutes if people would like to ask questions. There's one question which I'm going to fold in together that incorporates what Phil and Richard and Laura are asking of Mary, which is I guess a deeper delve into the meaning of the unhappy faces and how you sort of distinguish some of those more complicated responses within the infographics. So
absolutely, yeah. Thank you so much for this question. I'm just seeing it now in the Q&A. That's a wonderful question, and that was one of my central worries about this method, is that the faces themselves are so broad, right? And emotions themselves are so complex. And I think that was part of what made the method great, that it could, it was very nimble, it's very flexible, but also where the interviews really came in. And so that is where the I guess I would call them structured interviews. I had a very specific set list of questions that I asked everybody who was leaving as they were giving me their maps back. At the end, it would just take like about 5 minutes. And it was questions like, why did you put this sticker here? What does this sticker mean to you? And what were you feeling when you did this? And so I then was able to connect, not in the graphics that I showed in this, but I was able to connect the different kind of interpretations and how people were using those stickers with the maps themselves through those interviews. And so again, like a quick example, the angry face was a woman who was feeling very angry about the ways that the white owning families were amassing generational wealth through extraction of labor and lives from the Black enslaved people. So that's like what she talked to me about in the interview, and what I was able to then contextualize the angry face with. Thank you. Great questions.
Thanks, Mary. Any other questions? There's no one in the chat right now. In which case, I just want to pose a question for everyone, which is really, in a nutshell, I suppose. How did you feel that the call for landscape virtue and the common good, how did that change the research that you are doing? How, I suppose it's, what was it about this call that maybe altered some of the project work you've been doing before, or took you in an interesting direction? I don't know who wants to jump in first.
Me, I think it was crying out to talk about climate justice, really, climate injustice. So whereas I'd always been interested in researching rural landscape issues, I think it was to me just a very urgent rural landscape issue to address.
I think the same for us, probably what Richard was saying in the beginning about that kind of moral dissonance, the clear moral good of the end of coal mining, but the harms that it had wreaked to community, and looking forward to that, the sustainable energy in Scotland and how that kind of impacts on local communities today, so that's all feeding into that, especially very marginalized communities like people who use drugs and just local life. Like, how are these ideas of landscape virtue, how do they actually impact and filter through to everyday experiences and levels? So I don't know if you want to add to that, Richard.
I mean, I've always been interested in the idea of moral landscapes, or landscapes sort of taking on these charged moral characters. Previous research that I did was in the East Anglian Fens, and the whole history of drainage of the Fens is imbued with that whole question of, you know, what is it that motivates you to drain a swamp? It's the idea that, you know, not only the people who dwell in there, but the land itself is feckless and lazy. And so I was always struck by the way that, you know, those moral investments can be made in the landscape. And the same really was true in Fife, that we think, as we were just talking about climate justice and injustice, we think about that morally charged issue of the coal, make coal history, leave it in the ground, and so on. But there are other moral registers at work there. The question of the work ethic and what the work ethic of coal mining brought to community, the idea of solidarity and loyalty that really came out, you know, came from the ground, as in the quote Laura used. So yeah, I think that there was definitely, you know, that whole question of what makes a landscape a moral landscape immediately drew me into this call, for sure.
And I'll just say quickly about mine as well. I have always been really interested, or going into this work, I was interested in, well, what if the landscapes of these sites weren't just seen as either background or harmful, right? What if we can imagine plantation museums where the landscape itself is part of the common good and is helping people move towards justice, move towards a more equal future. And the way that I was then able to approach this work, I saw both, right? I saw people talking about how the landscape and the recreational opportunities was kind of diluting the message for them. And then also people who spoke very passionately about how the landscape was helping them to feel comfortable enough and sort of safe enough to engage with these hard questions. And so I think that one of my main takeaways, and something that I've shared with the site staff, has been what are ways to be intentional about managing these landscapes, managing interpretation in the landscape in such a way to keep that going and to do it on purpose, right? For the common good.
Great, thanks, Mary. Thanks for all those thoughts. I think that a couple of our panelists are busily typing answers to Brian's and Jeremy's questions, which I hope that's sufficient as a response, because we're out of time, unfortunately. I think we could be here for much longer. So I'm going to wrap up and hope that the answers appear as if by magic in the chat just as I finish. Just want to thank our presenters for 3 really, really fab and provocative and interesting takes on the question of virtue and justice in landscape. Thanks to everyone for coming and listening. And don't forget our current call, which the deadline for which is March the 30th, landscape and care. So thank you very much.